Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be discussing some English home language approaches, tips and techniques to assist you for paper 1. So this is how your English home language DBE paper 1 exam is set out. It's always important to have an understanding of what you're getting into and what you need to be preparing for. So it's a 2-hour exam worth 70 marks, and the big thing that is being tested in this exam, obviously you have 3 English papers, and each of the English papers has a different expectation and a different thing that the markers are looking for, a different aspect of English that they're testing. So this exam, what they're testing is your reading ability and how you can interpret texts. And so every single question presents a different type of text and encourages you to approach that text and to understand it and to deliver an answer that shows your comprehension, your understanding and your interpretation of that text. So that's really important to keep in mind. So what's really nice about English is that we know exactly that there's going to be 5 questions. We know the mark allocations, and so we can prepare ahead of time. And I specifically like to prepare in terms of my time management, because I know once I'm in the exam, I can get carried away and start talking about, maybe spending too much time on a comprehension or too much time on a summary. So over here, I'm going to detail for you how I would recommend that you allocate your time. Obviously, everyone is absolutely different, and so hopefully when you are preparing for paper 1, you have done some past papers and you've tested out how long you take on each section. So this is just sort of how I would advise it. So question 1 is your comprehension, is 30 marks, so that is a big chunk of the paper. So I would definitely allocate a large chunk of time to that, for example 50 minutes, because you're going to have to be reading that comprehension, which is often 2 pages long, and you're going to have to be answering quite a few questions, including a lot of 3-marker questions and even a 4-marker at the end. Then you have your summary, that's for 10 marks. I would spend around 15 minutes on the summary. Then you have your advertisement, which is 10 marks. I would spend around 15 to 20 minutes on your advert. And then question 4 is your cartoon. I would also spend around 20 minutes on that for 10 marks. And then question 5 is your language, which is 10 marks, but I would just spend 10 minutes on this because it is a relatively simple section compared to the others, in the sense that you don't have to write out full sentences as your answers. And then you have 5 minutes as checking time. So this is just a guide, just a reference point. I just want you to keep in mind when you are writing your exam, not to overspend time on certain sections, but to make sure that you answer all of the questions, because that's going to give you the best chance of success. So let's just chat about some theory that you need to study. I think there's a very common misconception about English in general, and specifically English paper 1, that you do not have to study for it, and that cannot be farther from the truth. There's a lot of theory to study, especially for paper 1. Things such as punctuation, sentence types, writing styles, register, types of contradiction, diction, tone, mood, intentional purpose, theme and message, pronouns. These are just a few things that you really need to be familiar with and you need to study. And if you go through past papers, you will see the recurrence of these theoretical type questions that come into the fold. So please remember to go look at your English textbooks, to go look at your English notes from school, and to study this theory, because it can come up in any of the questions in English paper 1. So I want to sort of take a little bit of a deep dive into all the different sections and give you a little bit of understanding of what your mark is looking for in the section and how you can approach it. So firstly, in the comprehension section, as we spoke about earlier, it is a big chunk. It is 30 marks. I have made a video about how to answer a comprehension, so I hope that you found that video and that you found it helpful. The big advice that I would give with comprehension is to read it through during your reading time and try and focus on understanding the main message or the fundamental theme of the text. I think oftentimes we get caught up in the details and we start looking at the counter arguments, we start looking at the examples, and we sort of obsess over those things instead of understanding what the main message of the writer is. Now that main message is so important because that is what is leading the writer into using certain stylistic techniques, into positioning the reader to believe something in a certain way. And so understanding what the main message is going to keep you focused in terms of what you need to be looking out for in the text, but also keeping you focused when you answer the questions, because you know that the use of pronouns that they're talking about has to do with the main message, or the use of diction in this paragraph is trying to emphasize the main message. So keep that main message in mind the whole time. Secondly, answering techniques, which links with the third thing over here on this list, which is mark allocations. So I would definitely advise the 1 sentence per mark strategy. I feel like in this way you are definitely going to get your marks because you're going to focus on providing at least 1 point per sentence. With your answering techniques, I would encourage you to use the question paper. So circle the keywords of the question and use those questions in those words from the question in your answer to guide your answers that you stay on track. So often what happens is that students get distracted, especially if it's a topic that they know. Maybe the comprehension topic is on a topic that you are passionate about, and then you'll start writing stuff, but it's actually irrelevant to what the question has specifically asked you. So circle the keywords in the question so that you stay on track with your answer and you don't get carried away. Remember that those different things that you've circled, those are going to give you your marks. So for instance, if they ask you, explain the diction in paragraph 5, you need to circle the word diction and you need to circle the word explain, and you should probably underline paragraph 5 because then you have to go and search for diction. And if this is a 3-mark question, then you'd see, oh, but there's only 2 things I'm answering. I'm answering diction and I'm answering explain. Let me provide 2 pieces of diction and explain those 2 pieces of diction, and then I have a sentence where I comment on it when I explain the effectiveness of it. The marker in comprehension is testing whether you have comprehended the information. And so therefore, if you look at any memo of any paper 1 paper, you will see a lot of reference to lifting, and you will see that there is a specific instruction to your marker to take off marks or to not award full marks if the student has lifted from the paper, from the text. Meaning that you need to try and write in your own words, because if you're just going to copy the words from the text, the marker cannot give you the marks that you probably deserve if you understood the text, because you haven't shown them that you have understood it. So remember, you can't be there to explain to your marker that you understood it. You need to show that in your writing. So by using your own words, that is going to ensure that your marker understands, oh, she has interpreted this question correctly, she has interpreted the question, and she's given a proper answer, she knows what the text is about, and she's highlighted the particular aspect of the text which is important, therefore I can award her her mark. So keep that in mind the whole time. Is my answer showing the marker that I have understood the text and that I have understood the intention of the question? Obviously, there is a time and place for quotes from the text, but when you quote, you must always explain your quote. The next thing I've put here is theory versus content or practical application. So when you're reading your question, you need to be analyzing your question. I feel like sometimes people rush and they just read the question and they immediately start answering it. I'd recommend you look at your question closely and you try and decipher, what's the marker testing? What's the mark allocation? How do they want me to answer this? And specifically, is this a theory question, or is this a practical question, or is it a combination? So if it's a theory question, this would be like a language question, which sometimes can crop up in comprehension, like, why has the parentheses been used? That would be an example of theory. That is just clearly a reference to, have you studied, do you know what parentheses does? Then you have your purely content or practical application questions, meaning what does the writer mean by, and then they give you a quote from the text, and you just have to explain what that is. More often than not, your 3-mark questions are a combination of theory and practical. A lot of past papers I've looked at recently have spoken about this, or have had this question of explain the paradox, and that is a very typical example of a theory and practical application question combined into one. In that answer, you need to show your marker that you know the theory of what a paradox is, that you know it's a form of contradiction. And then you also need to practically apply it to the comprehension and show how the paradox is featured in this comprehension and explain its relevance. My tip to you is don't ever just answer a theory question in comprehension. Always apply a little bit of practical application, even if it seems like a theory question. Because in comprehension, it is mainly practical application questions, or those 3 markers are usually theory and practical together. The purely theory questions are going to come up in question 5 in language. Then the last question of your comprehension is always the intertextual question that's worth 4 marks. And here you have 2 texts. You have text A, and then you have a visual text, text B. When you answer this question, I would always advise that you write down evidence from text A and that you explain the evidence, that you write down evidence from text B, explain the evidence, and then last sentence you can comment on it, whether you agree or disagree, do they support each other, do they contradict each other. So that's the structure that I would advise. As I say, I have a whole video on this on comprehension, so I really would advise that you watch that if you have not already. Question 2 is summary. Now, I want to just put in your heads that summary is slightly different from all the other questions that are asked in paper 1, because when you answer a typical paper 1 question, like in comprehension or advertising or cartoons, you are writing in full sentences, and it does matter that it makes sense, but summary is a bit more of a writing exercise, and so you really do have to focus on making sure that your writing is fluent, that your language and grammar is top notch, and that it really shows a sort of focused and, formal style of writing. So it's the only question in paper 1 where I'd really say concentrate on, obviously always concentrate on how you get your ideas across, that's really important, but this is the only time you have to do it in a sort of a long form way, like you would do in a literature essay in paper 2 or your essay in transactionals in paper 3, because your summary is typically 90 words, so it is probably longer than the questions that you are answering. In questions 1, 3, and 4. With a summary, I would definitely advise that you read your question carefully, because your question tells you the focus, and that's going to allow you to only focus and include relevant points in your answer. So remember that the text that they give you for a summary has some relevant points, but it also has some completely irrelevant facts in there that they put in there to see if you're really reading the question and if you're only going to include the relevant information, and they're only going to award you marks for that relevant information. Remember to take your summary, the text that you're given, and to highlight what the points are. You have to have 7 points to achieve the 7 content marks up for grabs in summary, and this is really a simple, easy 7 marks that I would say that anyone is capable of getting those 7 marks for summary, for getting 7 points from the text. The biggest reason why people don't get these marks is because, firstly, they don't count their points, so they don't realize that they don't have 7 points for the marker to give 7 marks to. And also, what they might do is they might get carried away and start using their own ideas, and that is strictly forbidden in this question. You have to use your own words, so don't just lift the words from the text. Once again, do you see how that links to the marker's intention for this whole paper? How have you interpreted the information, or have you comprehended the information? So if you're just copying, none of those skills are being shown off, therefore you're not going to get your marks. So make sure that you count your points and that you only include points that are in the text using your own words. A little tip as well, obviously you can be using synonyms to change the way the points sound. You can also change the sentence structure, and also another tip is, typically when we see a line, when we see a sentence, we struggle to put in our own words. So why don't you read the sentence, understand the main point, cover it up with your hand, and then try and figure out, okay, how can I say this in my own words? So when you're not looking directly at it, once you've written it, go back, lift up your hand and check that you have delivered the same piece of information and it's not just your own ideas, but you'll see it's automatically in a different word form. The words are different. Word count is really important. Read your instructions carefully and make sure you put the word count there. It should really be between 87 and 90 words. Do not go over, because you will be penalized. Fluency is really important. As I said earlier, it needs to really flow, because those extra 3 marks, so 7 points are for content and then 3 marks are for your language and grammar. So make sure your punctuation is spot on. Make sure you're using advanced diction. Question 3 is the advertisement. And the advertisement, I would say, out of question 3 and 4, it's typically easier to analyze an advert than a cartoon. Not to say that cartoons are difficult, but adverts are typically quite simple, because of the fact that their intention is very clear always. It is always to persuade the reader to buy a certain product. So even if it comes across as being philosophical or emotional, you must remember that the underlying reason for why that advertisement has been published is to persuade readers to buy a product. And so therefore you need to be aware of the advertising techniques involved. So you need to have a look for the visual and the verbal clues, techniques, or hints. Bold capital letters, for instance, are going to try and attract readers' attention. You might also see, a picture of a happy person enjoying the product. That's also going to be a technique that's going to try and persuade readers to buy a certain product. If they use emotive diction, then those sort of, words that make you feel emotions and make you feel certain things, that is trying to get you to buy the product. So everything is trying to propel you to buy this product. So just keep that in mind the whole time. And then you can analyze the visual and verbal techniques in that context. Remember, visual techniques have to do with the image that you see, the body language, the facial expressions, the color, the proportions, things like that. And with visual, you have to be very specific in your answer when you're providing a visual clue. So you can't just say, oh, the boy looks sad. Rather, you need to say, the boy's facial expression shows a tear coming down his cheek, therefore he is sad. Verbal clues, this has got to do with the actual writing in the advertisement. So this can do the slogan, it can refer to the body copy. And here we can use our sort of comprehension techniques to analyze the sentence structure. Perhaps, is it using the imperative? Is it commanding us on what to do? Or does it use emotive diction, for instance? And here you can quote it and you can explain it. Keep in mind your answering techniques that we discussed in comprehension with the mark allocations. Same idea. 2 marks, 2 sentences, 3 marks, 3 sentences. Question 4, we're looking at cartoons. So firstly, there is a bit of study involved before we can even answer questions on cartoons. You need to study your techniques of humor. So you need to know terminology such as irony, juxtaposition. I suppose juxtaposition is not humor, but you need to know irony, puns, sarcasm, satire. These are all techniques of humor. These are ways that humor is communicated by the cartoonist. Remember that a cartoon can have 2 intentions. So firstly, it could be used to entertain us, and we have those cartoons that you see come up in past papers where they're just purely funny and they're entertaining. But then you also have more serious cartoons where they inform or educate us about a particular issue. And these are usually your satirical cartoons where they mock a serious situation in order to draw attention to it. So with a cartoon, the same visual and verbal techniques that you looked for in an advert, you need to look for in a cartoon. They're just going to have a different effect in this case. So like an advert, maybe bold lettering can attract the reader's attention. In a cartoon, the bold lettering is going to maybe signify someone is angry or that they're shouting. And then remember your answering techniques once again, using the mark allocations to guide you, using the words of the question to guide you, and not getting carried away in going against the question, really focusing on answering the specifics of the question. And lastly, my favorite question in the whole paper is the language question. I think that this is such a wonderful question because there's so much you can do to prepare for it. There's so many terms you can study. There's a lot of theory you can study. But I know that a lot of people do struggle with this section and don't have the confidence to attack it with the vigor it deserves. And I think that that's a real shame. So my advice is definitely to study the terminology and the theory that you need, the functions of the punctuation marks, concord errors, malapropisms, and to give every single question a go. Don't leave anything out. The trick with this section is that you have to look at everything in context. So they give you that text, and I want you to actually think of it as a positive thing, because they're not just randomly asking you what's the function of a hyphen. They're giving you an example in context. So you can go back and read the sentence, and you can even figure out in that moment what the hyphen is being used for. So I think that that's something that you should sort of change in your headspace if you do typically view this section negatively, in terms of that the context really helps you understand what the language errors are in terms of figuring them out and correcting them. Look out for the main suspects. If you do a lot of past papers, you'll notice that they tend to repeat the questions that are asked, and in every single paper there's typically a concord error. There's probably some sort of apostrophe or comma error going on. So always just keep those ones at in the front of your head so that you can take them out when you need to. And when it comes to a grammatical error, you sort of go through a little list in your head on all the possible grammatical errors that there could be. The next thing is read the question really carefully. Do they ask you to identify something, or do they ask you to correct it? These are very different instructions. If they ask you to identify an error, it means you need to actually just take that error and write it down. If they ask you to correct the error, then you probably need to take what the error was, write down what the error was, and show the corrected version, rewrite the sentence with the correct version. So also just know the difference between the different kinds of language questions they can ask you. Sometimes they'll give you the specific name of a language question or of a language error, like they'll say malapropism or misrelated participle or concord error, and that involves you going back to your text and actually finding that concord error in the correct paragraph or in the paragraph that they've assigned you. However, you also have those questions where they actually just quote the sentence and they say correct the error. So just keep in mind those two sorts of levels of questions, and that's why you do need to be familiar with the terminology. In case they ask you to find the concord error, you need to be able to find it. But when you're having a look at the sentence that they've quoted, you can also think to yourself of the same sort of things. Okay, let me see, is there a concord error? Remember that sometimes you're going to have to add words in order for something to make sense, in order to correct the error, which is perfectly fine and perfectly reasonable, and you have to do that to get your marks, right? For a misrelated participle, for instance, you do have to add a subject and a finite verb. However, remember, don't add too much. You always just add what is necessary. You don't change the meaning of the sentence unless they have specifically asked you to. So just some general tips that I would advise in your study process for paper 1 is definitely to download past papers. Thankfully, the DBE website is full of past papers from many years, and it has all the marking guidelines attached, and that's really wonderful. Because this is such a skills-based paper, past papers cannot be, the value of past papers seriously must not be underestimated, because it's the more you practice, the better you're going to become at analyzing these texts. And also your exposure to all the different types of questions that they can ask is certainly going to be helpful, so that when you're actually in the exam, it's going to be a different text, obviously, but the same sort of questions. You're not going to be surprised by the way they phrase the questions. Furthermore, you'll also know what the markers are expecting, so have a look at that memo, see what they're asking for, and when you mark your work, obviously, and you can see then, you know what the markers are wanting, and you know also how to take your ideas and take your interpretation and put it into words. That is a skill, so it requires practice. The next important thing is to study the theory. As I said earlier, English paper 1, one of the biggest misconceptions is there's not a lot to study. There is. Definitely go and study your language, study the things that come up in comprehension, make sure you know that terminology so that you can apply it to the text and to the themes that are being discussed in those particular texts. Your mindset in the examination is so important, especially for this paper. I would argue for every single paper that you write, your mindset is important, but especially for English paper 1. Because if you haven't had a good night's rest, if you're feeling really negatively and you really are not in a good mood, then your marks are really going to suffer. Because in an English paper 1 exam, you don't have access to any of these texts beforehand. You are seeing these texts for the very first time, and therefore you have to be wide awake and you have to be able to think critically in the exam. You are reading a text, you're going to have to see, okay, that's that technique that over there, or this is what his argument is suggesting, or this is what they're trying to advertise to me, or this is the concord error. You're constantly thinking. It's not like when you do perhaps even English paper 2 where you have studied your poetry and you know your poetry, and obviously I'm not going to say you don't have to think in paper 2, you definitely do, but English paper 1, you've never seen these texts before, so you really have to be thinking critically on another level. So make sure your mindset is optimistic, is focused, and is that you're concentrating really hard, and that you're in the correct mindset to attack the examination properly. Focus on the intention. So I did mention this throughout the video actually. So what I mean by this is focus on the intentions of the text. So when you're doing comprehension, understand what the intention of a comprehension is. Understand what the intention of the marker is in terms of asking you these questions. When you switch to advertising, there's a different intention behind that advert. There's also a slightly different, although similar, intention of the marker when asking you the questions. The same applies to cartoons. I mean, if you think about summary, for instance, as we spoke about, this is a completely different intention, a completely different set of skills that you're being asked to do. So as you switch questions, and even question 5 for that matter, as you switch questions, think about what I've said about each question and change your headspace and change how you're thinking about it, because the intentions of each of those texts and the intentions of your marker in asking you each of those questions is different. The last thing I want to say is always try. I find it so heartbreaking when I mark papers where students just don't even attempt a question because they don't have the confidence, they don't believe that they can do it. Especially if you're watching this and you're about to write your final exam, definitely just give it a go. There's no harm in trying. And the beauty of English is that there's very rarely one singularly correct answer, except for question 5, right? Comprehension, summary, advertising, cartoons, there are many different interpretations. And so if you feel like you've interpreted something but it sounds strange to you, don't worry about it. It might really be strange. Write it down. Give yourself the chance to actually score some marks. And the big thing with English is if you're going to say something, approach every single question or every single answer as though it's a little argument that you're having, that you're trying to prove to your marker that you understand something. And you want to prove your interpretation of the cartoon or of the advert. So when you try a question, don't try it half-heartedly. Give it 100% effort and really explain what your reasoning was and what your thinking was behind coming up with this interpretation. So bottom line, read every question, analyze the question, and give it your best shot. I would definitely say in terms of exam techniques, if you don't understand a question, circle it, and you feel like, maybe you're not going to answer it, it's not going to be your best answer possible, circle the question and come back to it at the end, because you don't want to waste time working on something that you may not get the right answer to. Rather ensure that you get all the marks that you know you're going to be good at. However, you must come back to it at the end of the paper and you must attempt it. You must try it, because I think you'll surprise yourself. You might just score a mark or 2. And I also wanted to mention, I did advise your different timings at the beginning of the video for each question. Remember that that's not a hard and fast rule, so you need to tailor it to what suits you. But another thing that you can do is you can always start with the question, with the section that you know you're going to get the most marks for. So, for instance, if I was writing this exam, I would definitely start with question 5 because I feel like that's my strongest section. I could get a nice 10 easy marks in the bag. So, think to yourself, okay, is my strength comprehension? Is my strength advertising? Is my strength language? And maybe start with that question, just a thing to think about. Maybe to start with that question so you get some marks in the bag. However, bearing that in mind, I would never do the comprehension last. I know some people really struggle with comprehension, but because it's such a big section, because it's worth 30 marks, you can't leave it to the end when you're tired. So do it as one of the first things. Definitely, you got to tackle that comprehension. I hope that you found this video helpful and it just gave you some sort of idea of how to approach the exam and maybe a few tips and tricks. Wishing you the best of luck. Be confident, be optimistic. You've got this. Remember to explain yourself and to stay focused as you're answering every single question. Good luck.